All right, this is a video that's going to be kind of a tangent to my previous video that I uploaded yesterday about abortion. Now, abortion is a really interesting topic. It's a hot topic politically. It's something that people are both interested in a cerebral sense and also in a very visceral sense. And I got quite a few comments on that video, and I do actually want to make a direct follow-up video that goes over some of the points that people raised, because people did raise some really interesting points in the context of that discussion. But that's not what I want to do here. I want to just kind of go on a tangent on a related issue that came up in the abortion debate. Um, so also, I just want to say I do like the idea of, as I found myself replying to a lot of those comments, I kept thinking this is something that I don't want to just be a reply to a comment to that one person. Yes, they have a question. I want to answer their question to the best of my ability or engage in a discussion with them. But I do, because I like to spread ideas and I like to have an open forum here, I think that it will make sense in the future if I get a lot of discussion on a video to make a follow-up video where I go through the comments. So if you have a question or if you feel like there's something, a point you want to bring or a perspective that you think is valuable, I do suggest that you put a comment in the video because if I get a lot of those, there's a good chance that I will go through them, make a follow-up video. And I do want to do that for the abortion video. But for this, I want to address a more general topic that came up in the context of that debate and that comes up in the context of that debate, and that is the problem of child parent obligations. And I have actually made videos on this way back in 2011, 2012, because it is an interesting topic and one that I think you do need to grapple with when we're talking about abortion, because it does have a sway on that. So I think the first thing to talk about is just the idea of obligations generally. I think everyone, or not everyone, but almost everyone in the world agrees that, like, if you voluntarily enter a contract, if you voluntarily make an agreement that you have that includes obligations on yourself and or duties on yourself, that you can be made or forced to fulfill that obligation. I'm sure that there are people who disagree with that, or who might say that particular contracts don't meet the criterion. Maybe you were coerced, or maybe you didn't have the informed consent to make such a contract or whatnot. But that's it gets into specifics. I think most people recognize that if you make an agreement that involves you incurring some obligation or some debt, that you are then can be made through legal means to pay that debt. It gets a little bit more tricky though when we talk about so-called involuntary positive obligations. Now, libertarians talk a lot about negative rights, that you have a negative obligation to say not hurt somebody, not steal from somebody, not uh, you know not rape somebody. And I think again most people tend to agree with that idea. But the trick comes when we talk about positive obligations. Do you have an obligation for somebody, that's something that you didn't voluntarily agree to, right? If somebody comes up to you and says, you owe me this, and it's not something that you agreed with, do you in fact owe them anything? And there are different schools of thought on this. Now, if you ever read Michael Huemer's great book, and he has two great books that I've read. One is The Problem of Political Authority, which I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in libertarianism. I have to say, hands down, it's probably the best defense and explanation of anarcho-capitalism that I've ever read, bar none. Very fair, very readable. But he has another book called Ethical Intuitionism that is also quite good. And he talks about, and this varies culture to culture, but if we're talking about Western culture, so-called, or American culture specifically, when they do thought experiments where they ask people, well, do if you're like, they build lifeboat scenarios, and can a person, if you have, each of you own half a boat, can one person take a drill and drill a hole in their half of the boat and say, hey, this is my private property and I can drill a hole in this boat if I want, or whatnot. And or ideas of, like, are you obligated, if you're walking on the beach and you see a girl drowning in the water, are you obligated to go save her? Are you obligated to pay for someone's medical care, and so on and so forth? And of course, there's not consensus here. There's a lot of disagreement, and you get this kind of, the thing that's the most popular though is that people seem to believe that if it is possible to save somebody's life with a minimal of effort and without exposing yourself to much risk, then there is an obligation to do so. And so this wouldn't apply, say, if there was a girl drowning and there was a high risk that you would yourself drown. Say this is a tsunami, or there's a lahar from a volcanic eruption, and there's a child, or just anybody for that matter, who's in really serious danger of being drowned. But you could possibly go rescue them, but you might yourself drown in the case, in the attempt. Most people would understand, hey, if you're not really obligated in that case, you can hold back. It's not something that's wrong. On the other hand, if all it meant was getting your feet wet and there was no real chance that you would actually drown and that you'd be perfectly safe in doing so, most people think that you're obligated to do this. Now, in the context, he talks about this in the problem of political authority as well, and in terms of politics, this is kind of brought up as a red herring, because people will say, well, since there's an obligation to help those in need, if you don't have to risk too much, therefore the state is justified. And that just doesn't follow. If you look at what states do, only a tiny, tiny fraction, if any, of what they do is actually helping people who cannot be helped any other way. Most of their expenditures are going to things that are completely unrelated to that. And so the problem of this when it comes to justifying states, and is that people will make this argument, and there are literally no states that only adhere to that very narrow justification. They literally do thousands of times more stuff than that, and so there's that problem. But the other problem is, of course, not everyone agrees with this, and I come from very much the Rothbardian perspective of looking at it like I'm not sure that the majority of people's intuitions is sufficiently compelling to constitute an actual obligation, right? So I'm not sure that because somebody is in dire need and I'm in a position to maybe help them at low risk, that I'm actually obligated to do so. The example I used in the comments section of the abortion video was, if a starving child knocks on my door asking for food, and let's say that I have plenty of food, um, my instinct is to say that I have the right to slam the door in their face and say, get lost, get off my property. Now, I wouldn't do that, but I think I would have the right to do that. And there is a distinction that a lot of people don't make between behavior that might be virtuous or laudatory, and then extrapolating that or conflating that with then it's an obligation, right? It's one thing to say it's good to give to charity, you're a good person, it shows that you have character. And I think in general that's true, especially if they're not grandstanding about it and making sure that they get the maximum social points for making that contribution. Um, on the other hand, it's a huge step to then go, people can be forced to make similar content. As a huge ethical step. Uh, and I agree with the critique, and it was brought up in the comments. It doesn't matter necessarily if the majority of people believe X or Y. I mean, in practical purposes, it does matter with the majority of people, whether people believe X or Y. That's one of the reasons why I think it's valuable to be persuasive and try and have good arguments and try and have open discussions. Um, but to the extent that you think that there is any kind of objective morality, or morality that's maybe optimal in terms of utilitarian consequences, the intuitions of most people or the majority of people don't necessarily lead to the best results. And they certainly don't create a metaphysical obligation in and of themselves. So I have to say that I'm very sympathetic with that view. There is some debate though, and I think though when we're talking about child parent obligations though, I think that distinction, and that's an important argument to have, is irrelevant, and I'll say why. And this kind of what prompted this. I should probably say who, I don't remember the name, but one of the commenters in the abortion video was like, "Look, I'm a Rothbardian, and parents don't have any obligation towards their children, and so if they don't want to, if they shouldn't have to provide the nourishment, the mother shouldn't have to provide the nourishment necessary to bring a baby to term, and she can kick it out of her, and there's no obligation there." Now, as I talked about in that video, I think that is wrong, because while I might agree, and in fact I do agree, that random third parties don't have some kind of claim on your goods and services and that you don't owe them, right? I agree with that. I agree that, like I said, if some child shows up at your door and says, "Hey, I'm starving. Can I have some food?" You have the right to deny them. And people might say you're an asshole or whatever, but it's not a criminal offense. I think something that you have the right to do. And there's moral reasons for that, and then there's utilitarian reasons for that. As soon as we grant the authority to do that, we've opened up a Pandora's box, and it literally ends with nuking of cities. So, or at least sometimes can end that way. It ends with war and taxation and mass police states, and there's all the accoutrement evils of a state within society can come from that little camel's nose under the tent. But I think that it's irrelevant in the case of child-parent obligations because the children are not random third parties. Okay, if that same starving child who knocks on my door and is asking for food is starving because of my direct actions, if something that I had done put them in that dire position, then it's not like they're a random third party. Then there is an obligation there. And in that scenario, let's say that I was driving down the road, and instead of hurting somebody and putting them on life support for 9 months, I hit their storage shed where they were saving all their food for the winter, and I destroyed all of it. And now all of their produce and all their goods and services, the way that they were going to sustain themselves through the winter is destroyed. Uh, and that person shows up at my door and says, I'm starving because you destroyed all of my food and it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. It was entirely your actions that led to it. And again, I could say, listen, I wasn't intending to destroy your food. I was just driving and I was trying to be careful. And, it was just a momentary lapse in concentration, totally forgivable, 1 in a million chance, but it happened. And I'm sorry, but it's not my fault and I'm not responsible. Get lost, get off my property. You have no claims on my goods and services. And I think that that is wrong. I think that uh, one of the fundamental strengths and great things about libertarianism is that it believes in freedom and autonomy, but that comes always with responsibility. You should keep the proceeds if you make profits, and you have to take the losses when you take the losses, and you should be free to make the choices that you make, and then you should be free to do drugs, you should be free to eat whatever kind of food you want, and if you get cancer or if you get heart disease or if you get fat or if you become sexually undesirable or whatever happens as a result, that's also on you. And you can beseech others, you can always ask, you can petition people for help, you can always request philanthropy, and historically, there's a good reason to assume that you'll get something. You may not get everything that you want or everything that you ask for or everything that you hope for, but it's very likely that you will get something. And of course, the richer the society is, the fewer people there are who need to ask, and the more people there are willing and able to give, which I think goes a long way towards alleviating the problem, if not eliminating it completely. Um, uh, but this is not that situation. If you have put somebody in a bad situation, then you owe them restitution. That starving girl who you have put in that bad circumstance, that's your fault, and you need to own that. You do have an obligation. Now, it wasn't a contract that you signed, right? You didn't go to them beforehand and say, listen, I don't know who you are. You're a total stranger. Let's have a contract, and we'll outline what will happen if and when I put you into a dire situation, if I destroy your food supply. That probably will not have happened. It is possible that for situations that are quite common, like auto vehicular accidents or other kinds of accidents that are likely to be common, that a lot of people will have third-party insurance programs or restitution organizations or DROs, for Christ's sake, and uh, there'll be kind of standard procedures for handling that, and it will make such a thing quite streamlined. But it doesn't really matter and principally speaking, you're still obligated, even if you didn't have some kind of prior arrangement beforehand that outlined how to treat such a situation. And that was what the commenter, and again, I'm sorry for not remembering your name, was bringing up. It's like, well, I mean, the mother and the fetus don't have any kind of prior agreement, so there's no basis for them making any claims on the mother's resources because they don't have a contract. Well, you don't need a contract. If you harm somebody or put them in a dependent position, right? If you make somebody necessary to live on life support or need medical care for weeks or months or days or however long it is, then you are responsible for that and you owe restitution. I think that it might be necessary to have some kind of arbitration, some kind of, if there's a disagreement, I mean, people don't agree on what it is, it might be necessary to have some kind of arbitration. But to say that you have no obligation whatsoever, I think is completely wrong, and it's completely mischaracterizing the ethical landscape when you do that. So your children are not random individuals. They're not random humans for which you have no role, no responsibility, or anything. You created them. All right. When children are born, it is because two parents, two people, two adults made a volitional choice to either purposely create them or they did an action that stood the risk of that happening, and they are responsible for that, even if that wasn't their intention. Just like it may not have been my intention to hit you with my car, just like it may not have been my intention to harm you at work or to, destroy your crops or whatever else. The fact that I may not have been intending to do you harm doesn't alleviate me from responsibility of my actions. It's possible that if I take steps to be as careful as possible and it's clear that there was no malice, this might in some way mitigate my responsibility some, but it wouldn't make my responsibility zero. So you could use a condom and you could use contraception and you still have a pregnancy, and that doesn't give you the right to then kill the person who resulted as a result of your action. It might say, well, I really did my best to avoid this happening, so uh, there might be an argument there that you can, I don't know, maybe deliver earlier and use artificial, uh, and this is becoming increasingly possible, although it's still kind of early term in this, or an artificial womb, or maybe you can say, look, I really don't want a kid, so maybe it should be easier for you to put them up for adoption or whatever. I think there might be some mitigation there, but to the idea that there would be no obligations whatsoever because you didn't want to incur any. I mean, nobody wants to incur any obligations, and yet they incidentally end up doing it because they harm somebody else. And I don't think you can just get around that by saying we don't have a prior agreement. So uh, now, I think that what's true for abortion is also true for child rearing. Um, a newborn, especially and younger children, they're basically completely helpless, and it's not on any fault of their own. They're completely dependent, and that again is on either both parents or one parent in the case of rape, or one parent in the case of one of the other parents dying for whatever reason. And I think that the parents have an obligation to see them through this. Now, it's a little different because restoration, or restitution rather, uh, implies putting them back whole. If I steal $100 from you, then the restitution is, well, obviously I should pay $100 and maybe legal costs and, any damages or whatever. So, it might be a little bit more, might be a little bit less. Of course, one great quote I've always liked about this is that all matters of justice are by their very nature approximate. There is no way to make the situation as if the crime never happened. And so we have to do estimates. And of course, if you lose something that can't be replaced, say you lose a hand and there's no way to give you your original hand, even if we have prosthetic hands that are indistinguishable or even superior to your regular hand, it still won't be your hand. And there's nothing to say that you value your actual hand more than the superior prosthetic. Um, but that might be the best that we can do. And I think that there's a lot of particulars about child rearing that I don't think that a rough philosophical, metaphysical, um, ethical standard are going to answer every single question. I think that it's something that's going to vary a little bit. But so you're not doing restitution for a child, but you have put a person, an individual human life, into a completely dependent and vulnerable position. And I think that um, that puts a responsibility on you because it was your actions that led to this. And this is both the mother and the father. This is both parents. Um, to see that child, that person, to the point where they are no longer a dependent, um, vulnerable entity. And there's more than one way that can come about. I mean, you can always give your obligation. Someone else could voluntarily take that obligation from you. So this would be adoption. you could say, look, I really don't want to handle this. This is a responsibility that I wasn't looking for. Then you can find somebody else to say, okay, we want, or I want to become the responsible party for this individual that you are responsible for because of your actions. You don't want to hold that responsibility, so give them up for adoption. The other thing is just to rear the child, and then this becomes a question of like, well, how long does that take? What do you need to do? What does that exactly entail? Does that mean that you need to, you know, buy the child presents on Christmas and put them in a good school and pay for them to take swimming lessons and um, hug them and kiss them and uh, give them a puppy and pay for their college and and for 18 years or 20 years or 50 years or for however long, if your 30-year-old child wants to come and live at home because they don't want to work anymore, or they lost their job, or are parents obligated to let them do that? And these are actual real questions that people have. I think the answer to that's probably no. Uh, the answer is that, look, you created this life, you created a very vulnerable, dependent life, and I think that if you can get that person to the point where they are no longer that dependent, then you've made things right as far as they can be. And I also would say that I think that the point at which a child is not dependent is quite a bit earlier than people think. I think 18 is a far extreme late date to put on that. I think it's probably much closer to say 13 and even potentially younger. Um, and again, I don't think it is an interesting question. Are we going to gets into kind of another related issue of like, can you hold parents accountable for being inferior parents in some objective sense? I think most people in our society think the answer is yes. I don't know if that's true. I think that's a very tricky question. Obviously, people agree if there's some kind of abuse, if the parents are harming the children or killing the children, unless of course they're a fetal child, then there's this subset of the population, a very large subset, that believes that killing it is fine in that case, and a smaller subset that believes killing it is fine even after birth, up to a certain point that they're quite vague about. But most people don't agree with that. Now, I'm not saying that because most people believe X or Y that it's then true, uh, but uh, because I tend to not entirely like, but there's one thing with causing harm to a person. There's another thing of is it a crime to be a bad parent? You're not giving them Christmas presents. You're not being very loving. You're not buying them the puppy. You're not whatever, whatever, whatever. I think that those are probably not crimes, and probably can't be prosecuted. So as much as it's very similar to the can you be forced to be virtuous? And I mean, it's not a virtue if you're being forced to do it. That's one thing to point out. But another is that, and then there's also a whole host of moral hazard that comes with that. And because people were also criticizing, hey, I don't like abortion, but um, you know, you would need a state to ban abortion, and so I don't want a state, and so I'm against it. I had this same kind of argument was raised against circumcision. Maybe circumcision is bad, maybe it's not, but I don't want it to be banned because only a government could ban it. And if you're, I mean, one guy went so far as to say, if anyone who's anti-circumcision wants a police state. Um, yeah, I think that is kind of, again, going on to a separate topic of can a polycentric legal order or a anarchist society or an ANCAP society or a stateless society have laws at all, or have any kind of legal norms that have any kind of enforcement ability? And the answer is clearly yes. The harder question is, is the enforcement of whatever those legal ideas are those provisions or prescriptions, going to be optimal or suboptimal relative to what a state can provide? And I think that the answer there is much harder to arrive at. I think the answer is still yes, but that's where the actual debate is. The debate that a non-state society just simply can't is demonstrably false, because we have examples. Every non-state society for which we have has legal norms and has prescriptions and has methods of dealing with that. And you can argue the pros and cons and how effective they are relative to a state. Absolutely, that's a fair thing to point out. But to pretend like it can't happen or it doesn't happen is not correct. Um, just factually, empirically false. Um, so, I don't think bad parenting is a crime, and I think that children at a fairly young age are have like the minimal obligations that the parents have incurred have been fulfilled. But I think that there is room for debate here. One of the ways I put it in my first video is that there are probably going to be, as there are today, some norms about what is the expectation of raising a child. So currently, and I think that this is wrong, but currently most people seem to think that parents should be obligated to take care of their kids at least until they're 18 and at least until they finish high school. Now, obviously, I'm against kids going to high school, and I think that the age of emancipation is probably much closer to 13 or 14 than it is to 18. But being that that's what the cultural norm is now, I think it would be fair to say that any two adults who consentingly have sex, they know that there's a risk that they could conceive a child, and that should entail the possibility that they would then be obligated to fulfill the cultural and potentially legal norms that are entailed in child rearing, which are as roughly what I outlined just now. Now, I think that the cultural norms of child rearing ought to change and become teleologically a lot less demanding than they currently are. Uh, but whatever they are, that's the risk you have. And people say, well, won't this stop? People will never have sex. Well, no, they will. They'll just be extra careful. Uh, and they'll be more careful than they otherwise would be. And um, I don't think that, look, there's lots of things that you can incur, like when you go to college or you take out a home loan, or there's lots of things that you can do that have the potential to place you into a difficult financial situation or a long-term uh, restitutional arrangement. And that doesn't mean that those things never happen or that they completely stop anything from occurring. And of course, you have always the people who are looking to have children. Um, uh, and I just find this idea though that your children are random third parties for which you have no obligation really just indefensible. And I know that maybe sounds like I'm just adopting the consensus view of philosophically illiterate Luddites who have never thought about it and are just kind of um, engaging in social proof and conservative bias. And I hear that, but there's a pretty strong argument that the parents are actually responsible. It was their actions that created the child. It's their actions that put them in the position of being vulnerable. And that's true even if you want to say that you consider abortion okay, which I don't think is very logically consistent, but whatever, let's say that it is. Once a child's born, it's not like that child randomly became an infant just from some quantum physics, quantum mechanics quirk just appearing, right? It was the mother and the father who got together and they had a good time, they had a fling or whatever. Maybe they didn't, maybe they had bad sex. It doesn't matter. They agreed to do it, or in the case of rape, one of them agreed to do it. And either the two of them or the one of them are the ones who are then responsible. Like literally, there's no question. It's not like if that proverbial child came to my door and there had just been a blight that destroyed their crops, a blight for which nobody was responsible or could be shown to be responsible. Then yeah, I don't owe them anything. It wasn't my fault. But if I'm the one who killed their crops, then that's a different situation. That's a completely different situation. I think it's obviously completely a different situation. That helpless newborn infant or toddler or child, period, that is not capable of taking care of themselves to the degree that they're not, it's because the parents created them. It's not for any other reason than that. And so, yes, they are responsible. They're not a neutral third party. They're not uh, uh, a random, person with whom there's no obligation or there's no positive. No, it was your actions that created them, and you need to take responsibility for them. And I don't know how libertarians can be so, some libertarians anyway, can find that so abhorrent. yes, you should be responsible for your actions. This is hands in hand. The same. I get a lot of flack like, oh, you just want like young people to be free to do whatever they want. No, I think that the age of consent should be lowered quite a bit. That it should be based on competency and capability. That there's a gradation of freedom, and that also not only should they be able to sign contracts and work and consent to sex or to get married or to not go to school or to drive or a host of other things. I also think that if they commit a crime, that they shouldn't get a slap on the wrist because they're not 18 yet. Uh, and so it's always autonomy always comes with responsibility. Freedom always comes with a cost. That's not two. And if you eliminate one, if you say, oh, you should be able to do whatever you want, but then not have to live up to the consequences, then that creates unbelievable moral hazard. Not only is it ethically wrong in cases where the negative consequences of your actions directly harm somebody, but it just creates a moral hazard where you can do risky things that potentially harm people with reckless abandon or more abandon than you would normally do because you are insulated from the consequences of that. And I just don't think that that's justified. So anyway, that's my thoughts on it. I do think that parents have some obligation to their children. I do not think that children have any obligations to their parents, and this is something that culturally people do not agree on. In the West, I think most people do agree with that to some point, but obviously, if you look at, say, a culture like China, where filial piety is a huge deal, and there's kind of this sense that like children are the property of their parents, and until their parents die, children are more or less on the hook to do whatever their parents say. That's their cultural norm, and maybe we should listen to their ethical arguments for that. I haven't been persuaded by any. I don't think that makes a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense to people in East Asia and a couple other cultures out there, enough so that I shouldn't just be completely dismissed. But um, yeah, I don't. Parents definitely have an obligation towards their children, and I think not only do most people agree with that, but there's pretty strong arguments for that why that would be. And I think it's almost absurd to the point of just being contrarian to say, oh no, no, parents don't owe anything to their children. It's just a random stranger. And like, no, no, no. It was you who put them in that position. And even if that wasn't your intention, I mean, it's doubly weird when parents wanted to have children. I can't even begin to imagine somebody who would argue that two people who said, let's get married and raise a family, and then 5 years down the line, be like, you know what, this just isn't working. Let's just throw our kids in the dumpster, um, or just evict them, right? Evict them stop them from trespassing out of my house. Um, it's obviously our culture. There's a consensus in our culture. There's a conservative bias that would be wrong, but there's a really strong ethical argument running along Rothbardian private property principles that would be also be wrong. And enforcement, that's another question that's worth looking into. I'm not going to go into it here, but anyway, those are my thoughts. Video on the abortion video in a couple days. See if I get any more comments on that. And if you have any thoughts regarding this, feel free to let them go, put them down below, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.